Hello, and welcome to all generations, and those who don't think they fit in a generation. In this video, I will be going over how generations came about, how the 8 most recent generations were named, birth years for those generations, a little on people who don't fit well into the main generations, the definition of generation, and why we separate generations. Generations are a bit of a fuzzy topic, and it's not universally treated the same. But I'll get into that a little bit more later. On this channel, I'll be discussing different things related to generations, so subscribe if you would like to see more. Note that most of this takes a more US-centric or at least Western-centric point of view, and while some generations and generational concepts can be applied globally, it doesn't always fit well. Some countries or regions will have a single generation that they'll name because of some unique event that a group of people would have gone through in their country, while others might use the regular generations and change years or names slightly. It really varies, but I just wanted to note that. So what are the generations? The generations I'm going to go over in this video are the lost generation, the greatest generation, the silent generation, the baby boomers, Generation X, Millennials, Generation Z, and Generation Alpha. Since the last 2 I mentioned are relatively new, it's definitely possible a new name could replace either of those, and birth years could change, so keep that in mind, especially true with Generation Alpha. There are a large number of generations retroactively named by generational writers Neil Howe and William Strauss, but I will not be going over those in this video. So where do the generations come from and who are they? In a sense, each generation came about as it was named. So how were the generations named? Most of the past generations were named by writers, though the writers didn't always know that at the time. More recently, the general public can have a big influence as what people are talking about in Googling can influence what ends up being the term that is more used. I'll go over each generation I mentioned earlier to help you understand though. The oldest generation I'm going over today is the lost generation. It is believed that no one is left still living from this generation. All the generations I'm talking about after this, there are still members alive. The last living member of this generation that we know of was a Japanese woman named Nabi Tajima, who died in 2018 at the age of 117. Gertrude Stein is said to have heard the term lost generation used by a garage owner in France to refer to the younger generation. She used the term on Hemingway, who then quoted her in the epigraph of his book, The Sun Also Rises, and also mentioned the term in A Movable Feast. The lost generation is often used to describe the writers of this time period, more so the expat nomadic writers like John Dos Passos, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, but it is also used as a general term to describe people who lived through World War I. After the war, many felt lost and directionless, thus the term the lost generation. Strauss and Howe, who I mentioned earlier, used the term in their books, and that helped solidify the name. The birth years for this generation start around 1880 to 1883 and go through 1900. After the lost generation came the greatest generation. Strauss and Howe in their book Generations refer to this generation as the GI generation initially, with GI standing for general issue or government issue, among other things. And at first, this is the name that was used, and some do still use it, but the greatest generation has become a little bit more commonly used. Just to mention, William Strauss and Neil Howe do have their own theory on generations, which is its own thing, but I will not be covering that in this video. Another nickname for this generation is the World War II generation. As the name implies, many members of this generation served in World War II. It was in 1998 that Tom Brokaw came out with a book called The Greatest Generation, which referred to people who grew up during the Great Depression and served in World War II, and so that is the name that ended up sticking more so. The Great Depression and World War II were not the only things that influenced this generation. During their formative and coming of age times was also a time of rapid technological change. The birth years for this generation vary depending on where you look, but usually they start around 1900 to 1902 and go through 1924 to 1928-ish. There is also something called the Interbellum Generation, which is not as widely used, which refers to a subset of this generation, and is kind of meant to refer to those who were not the right age to serve in either World War, though in the end many of them did serve in World War II. Now we have the silent generation. The term silent generation is believed to have first appeared in a Time essay in 1951, but we don't know where the essayist got this idea from, so who knows. Some say the characteristics that define this generation, such as being civic-minded and conformist, are the reason for this name, but others think maybe it has something to do with growing up during the McCarthy era. Birth years are generally thought to start around 1925 to 1928 and go through 1945. Members of this generation were born during the Great Depression and World War II, and during their teenage and coming of age years, they experienced the post-war economic boom. They are also called the lucky few. Of the next generations, the silent generation is the least well known. Now, for the most widely recognized generation, the baby boomers. And the name says it. Following World War II and the return of the soldiers, there was a sudden spike in fertility. Many had put off having children, and they decided it was time. The eventual drop-off came once the birth control pill became accessible, though the generation aging likely played a role as well. The term baby boom is not exclusively used for this time period, though usually when someone says baby boom, they are referring to the time after World War II. A baby boom is simply a temporary period with an increase in the birth rate. The post-war baby boom was also not unique to the US, but the affected region's exact timing varied a little. While the term baby boomer does come from baby boom, the actual term baby boomer was not seen until a news article in 1963. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964, and compared to other generations, the birth years are a lot less disputed because it is such a specific demographic factor that is influencing it. While most just slap on 1946 to 64, the US Census Bureau actually goes so far to say mid-1946 to mid-1964. They make a point that the war ended for the US in August 1945, and a typical gestation is 266 days, so that puts us at May 1946 at the earliest. After the boomers came Generation X, sometimes referred to as America's forgotten middle child. I think this is partly due to the sheer number of boomers and millennials on either end, so they're a smaller number in between. This generation is partly defined by that drop-off in birth rate after the boomers. Sometimes it's referred to as the baby bust, though this generation has also been given other nicknames like the latchkey generation and the MTV generation. Generally, they are defined as being born in the 1960s and 70s. Birth years start 1965 and go through somewhere between 1979 and 1980 to 81, most commonly 1980. The term Generation X was actually first used in the 1950s by a Hungarian photographer in a photo essay. He was referring to the generation growing up after World War II. Over time, the term Generation X was used in more books. In the 1970s, a punk rock band came out with the name, which is pretty fitting because I think a lot of Gen Xers I know are really into music. Now let's get to how is it really Generation X. It was in Douglas Copeland's 1991 book Generation X, The Accelerated Culture, that the term really caught on to refer to this generation. Next we have Millennials. Millennials are the first generation to come of age during the new millennium. Millennials started as Gen Y, the obvious choice after Generation X, but after Strauss and Howe used the term millennials in their book Generations, the term really caught on. Gen Y or Generation Y and millennials are still sometimes used interchangeably though. While Gen Xers are thought to be born in the 60s and 70s mostly, millennials are thought to be born in the 80s and 90s. Birth years vary, but generally they are thought to start around 1977 to 1981, usually 1981, and go through somewhere between 1993 and 2000 or so. Usually 96, 97. As many millennials are children of boomers, they are also referred to as the Echo Boom. Many of them came of age during the financial crisis of 2008 and during a rapid change in technology. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were also big for this generation, as was 9/11. Generation Z, which is the generation after this, was really too young, or in some cases not even born yet, to comprehend this event. Jason Dorsey, the president of a company which studies generations, goes so far to say, if you don't have an emotional memory of 9/11, then you are not a millennial. That brings us to Generation Z. Since the ending birth years for millennials are disputed, so are the starting years for Generation Z. Currently, they're thought to start around 1995 to 1997 and go through somewhere between 2012 and 2015, usually 2012. Since we had Gen X and then Gen Y, makes sense to go for Gen Z. There were other early name suggestions, but so far Generation Z, or Gen Z, has been the most popular one. Strauss and Howe, who I mentioned earlier, call this generation the Homelanders, though, so that's another popular name. and I plan to go over some of the other names for this generation in its own video, possibly. This generation has been growing up in a time where things like smartphones and social media and the internet are ubiquitous. It is likely that current events and future events will likely be important social markers for this generation as well, though. And what comes after Z? A. Or if we're going with the Greek alphabet, little hint there, it would be alpha. It's definitely possible that this is just a placeholder for now and another name could take its place though. So where did this term come from though? The term Generation Alpha was coined in 2005 by Australian Mark McCrindle. He also calls them Generation Glass due to the glass that they use or he thinks they will use in the future, such as on cars, on your wrist, and so on. The current speculative birth years for this generation start around 2010 to 2013 or 2015, going through 2024 to 2025. Generations after this are yet to be known. One criticism some people might have about generations is what makes someone born in 1980 so different from someone born in 1981. Some people feel they don't 100% fit into any generation. This is especially true for people at the very beginning or very end of a generation. So there is something called subgenerations, and in the case of people born at the beginning or end of a generation, Cuspers or Cusp generations. Now these are not widely used or studied, but they are a thing. Cuspers may also be born during years which are disputed between generations, so they may not feel confident in which generation they do fall in. Some examples of cusp generations include the sandwich group, which is the cusp between silents and boomers. Generation Jones, which is the cusp between boomers and Generation X, though I think it incorporates more boomers. Zennials, Gen X, Millennials. And then there are some ideas for the cusp group for Millennials and Generation Z, such as Millennials with a Z, Minion Z, and Zillennials. Comment which one you think is best or if you have a better idea. So let's back up a little. What is a generation? There's a lot of ambiguity surrounding the idea of generations, and a lot of people are just pointing fingers at one another saying, oh, well, you're only using it for this purpose, so it's not valid, or oh, you're ideas aren't theoretically rich, or you're not specific enough, or you don't use these markers which you should use, and so on. There's a lot of dispute in this area. Dr. Stephen Mintz wrote what I thought was a good article on the website Psychology Today, and I want to read a little quote from him. In his piece, he said, "The precise meaning of a generation is contested. It has been viewed as a culture, a demographic, an outlook, a style, an economy, a scene, a literature, a political ideology, an aesthetic, an age, a decade, a way of life, a marketing category, and a lazy shorthand. Age cohorts clearly differ markedly in the homogeneity of their experience." Clearly, there are many different ways people interpret and use generations. In the past, and sometimes still today, generations can be used to refer to family-based roles like grandfather or daughter and so on. In this case, we're talking about something more akin to a birth cohort though. Basically, the idea is that because people were born during a certain time and grew up and came of age during a certain time, the experiences of that period would somehow differentiate them from people who grew up during other times. Keep in mind that historical events and changes in the environment can affect people differently. First of all, your specific age can affect things, but also your gender, your race, your exact location. For example, someone who lived in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina would have had a very different experience of that event than someone living in Alaska. Differences in the technology you grow up with can vary across a generation as well. Carl Mannheim had come up with the idea of generational units to kind of address some of this, the kind of sometimes polar opposites within a single generation, but this is less touched upon today. Generations typically span around 15 to 20 years, but it can vary slightly, and how rigid people are to this can vary as well. Some say that they think generations should be shorter due to rapid shifts in technology during certain times or times of a lot of different events, while others are very strict about believing it should be kept at least that long. Different groups of people have different motives and purposes for studying the generations, and they may also change the names or the years slightly depending on those motives. So why do we have generations and why do we separate them? Really, they came about from a mix of circumstances, and a lot of different people played a role in how we view them today. It's not just one person that kind of came up with the idea. Having defined generations helps researchers get an idea of how growing up during a specific time period can shape someone's views and opinions and behaviors, though. Generations also make it easier for researchers to look at trends. For example, we can see at the same age, millennials are more educated than boomers were at the same age, and they are more educated than silents were at the same age, and so on. Examining generations also allows us to get a snapshot of a group of people at any certain period of time. Keep in mind that while generations can differ over time at the same age and they can be different right now, some of them who are different right now could have had more things in common when they were the same age. Olives are gross. Are you kidding me? Olives are great. I guess when I think about it, I didn't like olives at your age either. And now I also want to quote the think tank Pew Research Center. An individual's age is one of the most common predictors of differences in attitudes and behaviors. They say, age denotes two important characteristics about an individual: their place in the life cycle, whether a young adult, middle-aged parent, or retiree, and their membership in a cohort of individuals who were born at a similar time. The nature of age as a variable allows researchers to employ an approach known as cohort analysis to track a group of people over the course of their lives. Age cohorts give researchers a tool to analyze changes in views over time. They can provide a way to understand how different formative experiences interact with the life cycle and aging process to shape people's view of the world. Again, part of how you define generations does depend on what you plan to do with that information. And I just wanted to mention one more time that different groups do take different interests in generations, and with their own unique motives and reasons for studying them and looking at them, they may also define them slightly differently and use them slightly differently. And to finish, I want to remind you that the boundaries and specifics of generations are more guidelines than rules. It is a soft science. You shouldn't ascribe any type of wider generalization to all of the individuals in a generation. And you also don't need to adopt your generation as your identity. Now, please like this video if you found it helpful or interesting, and subscribe to hear more content on generations. See you next time.